Good morning. I'm Anthony Bly. I'm a soils field specialist with SDSU Extension, and this is the second day of crop hour for soil health. Um, Yesterday we had a really good presentation about integrating livestock, and today Hans Klopp and I have decided to share the time um, and talk about soil carbon because of all the issues and interest and confusion and around soil carbon. So at the end of at the end of both of our presentations, we'll offer the CCA credits. Please remember that at the bottom of your screen, there's a chat and a Q&A, and we'll be monitoring those. And if you have a question, just enter it in there, and we'll get to that. Hans will be giving a short period of time after he's done to answer questions, so we'll catch them then. So um, I think that covers all the details of what we want to do. Um, Again, thank you for your attendance and your interest in this topic. So, Hans, with that, you could go ahead and bring up your presentation.
Thanks for the introduction, Anthony. So I'm going to talk about carbon measurements of soil that are used to indicate how much soil carbon in the soil, the carbon biochemical cycle, and some studies where I have analyzed soil carbon concentration under different management practices. So I'm having some. So carbon is probably the most important element in the soil. And one of the most important parts of soil carbon is it helps the soil retain nutrients and water. Generally, as there's more soil organic carbon, there's higher cation exchange capacity, which is a measurement that is used to see how much cations the soil can retain, which is affected by clay content and organic matter content. You can't really change clay content at a location, but you can manage to improve the organic matter content. And water retention in soil also is improved as when you have more soil organic carbons. So if you manage to increase your soil organic carbon concentration, you can increase the ability of the soil to retain water. And carbon also is important in the formation of soil structure, where carbon will bind with clay, sand, silt, and clay particles and form aggregates or clods or whatever you want to call them. And when the aggregates are more strongly held together, they're less likely to break down when wetted, which if you have stable structure when the soil is wet, it keeps the aggregates together and allows water to infiltrate into pores in the soil. And if you have stronger soil structure near the surface, your soil is less likely to blow away when it's really windy in South Dakota, such as when we've been driving around in the winter and seeing snert in the road ditches of soil blowing away because the soil is not well managed in some locations. And the organisms in the soil eat carbon, such as from corn stover that is left when you harvest the crop here, which is cycled into the soil by biology, and then organisms eat that. And some of that's converted into other forms of carbon in the soil, which we'll discuss. And one of the big things people are interested in soils and carbon now is soil can store carbon, and it potentially can remove some of the carbon as CO2 in the atmosphere into the soil where it's stored in different forms of carbon. And there are many types of carbon in the soil, such as I discussed. Mineral associated carbon is carbon that is considered to be sequestered or removed from the atmosphere and likely will remain in the soil for a long period of time. And it's usually and I'll talk about it more in future slides. And particulate organic matter that is returned from plant roots and above ground plant biomass, such as the corn ruts and corn stover that's left in the field when you harvest the corn. And there's soluble chemicals created through decomposition and exudates from roots in the soils, which are like sugars, proteins, carbohydrates. And there's living organisms in the soil, which are very important in the biochemical cycle. And then there's inorganic carbon, usually which is usually carbonates, which in South Dakota soils you need to account for if you're looking at carbon, because South Dakota soils have a lot of carbon in the subsurface soil. And on the right, I made some pie charts, and near the soil surface, there's very low carbonates generally, but there's a lot of particulate organic matter carbon, or carbon that's being returned to the soil via biology, and more soil microbes near the surface. And in the subsurface soil and the soil such as I'm going to talk about later in this presentation, like half the carbon in the 16 to 24 inch depth of the soil is carbonates or inorganic carbon. And there's less of the other forms of carbon in the soil. So one measurement of carbon is total carbon, and it includes all the living and dead carbon in the soil. Both inorganic and organic carbon is in total carbon. And this carbon, because it's just all the carbon together, has different periods of time that it remains in the soil. And near the surface, total carbon is mostly organic carbon. If you're in the soil in the eastern US, which is more weathered, your carbon concentration just decreases with depth, and most of the carbon is inorganic carbon. But in semi-arid areas or arid areas, there's a lot more of the carbon that is inorganic carbon. So some studies in the eastern US just report total carbon and assume it is organic carbon, but that you definitely need to account for inorganic carbon if you're measuring carbon in South Dakota soils. And the most common way to measure total carbon is by dry combustion, where they put the soil into a total carbon nitrogen analyzer and they combust it, and then they measure the CO2 gas that's released, or it can be done through chemical titration. I've included soil organic matter here, which is assumed to be about 58% carbon, which I think Anthony will talk about later in this presentation too. And when a lot of labs, when you send your samples in for soil fertility analysis, will give you soil organic matter, and soil organic matter can be is easier and cheaper to measure than using a total carbon nitrogen analyzer, because you can use a larger sample and you just put the soil in a muffle furnace and measure the difference between oven dry soil and combusted soil. And what you lose is soil organic matter, but carbonates also affect the soil organic matter measurement. The, the form of carbon that is very complex, such as the complex structure on the right, is mineral associated organic carbon. And most of the mineral associated organic carbon is complex carbon compounds like this, and they associate with the soil clays and form complexes with the soil clays. And the types of clay and amount of clay affect how much carbon it can be stored. So soils with smectite, which a lot of soils in South Dakota have, can probably sequester more carbon than soils which are kaolinitic, which is a 1-to-1 clay. And this carbon can remain in the soil for a long period of time. And these compounds are formed during the microbial composition process, but they also can be mineralized into CO2 too over time. So they're not necessarily permanently in soil, but they remain in soil for a longer period of time than such as corn residue. And there's different ways to get at this. One of the methods they use is they apply an acid to the soil, and what remains is like the humic and fulvic acid, which are mineral associated organic carbon. Or you can measure particulate organic matter, which I will sort of have mentioned and we'll discuss in the one of the next slides from the total carbon. So particulate organic carbon is mostly affected by biomass return to the system. And in soil health, they've been measuring this frequently because if you have rotations that do not return much carbon to the system, you should get this property should change more rapidly than a measurement such as soil organic carbon, because the wheat or corn or soybean residue doesn't remain in the soil for a very long period of time, whereas the humic and fulvic acids remain in the soil for a long period of time. And this is just considered carbon particles larger than silt size. And this probably has a less than a couple year residence time in the soil. It probably depends upon how wet or dry the environment is and how much is being returned to the system. And some of this carbon may be converted to mineral associated carbon compounds, but it also could just be mineralized and used as food by other microorganisms in the soil. And this is measured by using the sodium X, the same chemical used to measure particle size, and then you wash the soil through the sieve, and then you take the fraction that's larger than sand size and you put it in a total carbon analyzer. Or you can just put it in a muffle furnace and get particulate organic matter, not particulate organic carbon. Water-soluble organic carbon is these various compounds, such as root exudates, which is chemicals that are released from the roots into the soil, sugars, fats, amino acids, and organic acids. And these compounds are formed through biological process. This is a pretty small fraction, like less than probably 1% of the total carbon in the soil. But it's easily affected by management because all these chemicals that are formed through biological process. And if your soil is biologically active, you will have more of these compounds. And if your soil is not very biologic, doesn't have a very active biological community. And this is determined by wet oxidation. You just put the soil in water and shake it and remove the water, and then you use the same type of analyzer that's used to measure carbon content in lake or river water. Another form of carbon is microbial biomass carbon. And this also is more easily affected by management than total carbon or the mineral associated carbon. And it consists of all organisms that are, I guess it's not, maybe I should just say it's biomass carbon, because earthworms and things I would consider important biology too in the soil, but it consists of bacteria, fungi, actinomyces, protozoa, nematodes. And it's essential for these are essential for soil biochemical functioning and making nutrients for plants, plant available, and carbon cycling. And what you do to measure this is you can fumigate the soil and titrate and see the change. Or there's also different measurements, like such as FAME, to get the amount of bacteria and fungi and the ratios them. And some people go as far as DNA analysis of soil to see what actual microbes are there. Now I'm going to talk about inorganic carbon, and this is mostly carbonate minerals such as calcite and dolomite. A parent material is that is high in calcite and dolomite is limestone. So some of the soils are formed from limestone, but carbonates in soil also can be formed through geochemical processes that occur in the soil. And so near the surface, you'll have carbonates in the parent materials, and they will dissolve and move deeper into the soil. And where the water stops going down deep into the soil, the carbonates will precipitate into the soil and form a white color, such as is at the bottom of the soil monolith. And the concentration of inorganic carbon in the soil depends upon the amount of precip you have, the parent materials the soil is formed from, and the CO2 concentration in the water in the soil affects the pH of and equilibrium reactions with carbonates and carbonic acid. And this is usually measured by either titration with an acid or you apply an acid to the soil and see how much CO2 is released. In a horizon such as in this picture, the white horizon is called a calcic soil diagnostic horizon, which it needs to have a certain percentage of carbonate, and it's included in some of the. If you look at soil classification and soil descriptions, you can see the mention of that. Here's a picture of the organic carbon cycle. So through photosynthesis, in the atmosphere, there's CO2, oxygen, nitrogen gas. Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and releases CO2. Certain plants that can fix nitrogen can take nitrogen gas from the atmosphere and convert it to organic nitrogen. Plants also respire and re reduce CO2 to the atmosphere. Biology in the soil, additionally, that decomposes organic carbon created through plants, also can release some CO2 to the atmosphere. That came up in our presentation yesterday. Someone mentioned methane in the questions, and ruminant animals release methane through their digestion process, and all animals, including humans, release CO2 when we breathe through the atmosphere. Mineralization and breakdown of carbon in the soil can reduce some CO2, and humans also reduce release CO2 through actions that we do. And in wetlands, rather than use oxygen as an electron source, they use other nitrogen and CO2, and they can release methane and nitrous oxide. And there's also carbon process that goes on in the ocean and in surface waters. Here's another picture of the soil carbon cycle. So you have carbon removed from the atmosphere through fixation by plants. The plants die and organisms eat them, such as worms, and help break them down farther than during decomposition. And then during the decomposition process, the microbial community will break down some of the complex plant carbon and plant structures. And some of the carbon that is formed will go into the formation of mineral associated carbon, whereas other forms of the carbon will just be used for energy and then released through respiration as CO2. And in your farm scale, there's methane emissions from livestock. So here's another further mention of carbon cycle and anaerobic conditions. And this is just, I'm just mentioning this because people discuss nitrous oxide and methane, which are two major greenhouse gases. And in this process, this occurs in the soil, such as in wetlands, when it's fully saturated and no oxygen is present. And instead, there's microbes such as bacteria, or I think archaea, that use compounds other than oxygen to get an electron source to break down carbon. And this process is slower than in aerobic conditions, but as your oxidation reduction potential decreases, nitrogen and manganese and iron and sulfate, and then carbon is changed to reduced forms. And in agriculture, people are concerned about the denitrification process because it takes an important plant nutrient and to it converts it to nitrogen gas, although in some of the process, sometimes nitrous oxide can be released in this reaction. Like a lot of these chemicals are plant nutrients plants need, and when it's anaerobic, you can lose nitrogen and sulfate in your soil. So essentially, carbon dioxide is converted to methane. This only happens in very anaerobic conditions, but that is one way how methane is produced, where CO2 is reduced to methane, and nitrogen in the whole chemical reaction that's carried out generally is converted to nitrogen gas. However, it goes through a cycle where it's reduced from a +5 to a +3 to +1 to 0 electron charge. And sometimes the nitrous oxide can be released in this chemical reaction series. Here's a study that I conducted in the state south of here. This is in Sydney, Nebraska. So it's a similar climate as farming in southwest South Dakota. So it's very dry. And the rotation they're using here is a winter wheat corn fallow. And they took land that was enrolled in CRP and they converted it to 4 different tillage practices. And then after we went through one rotation cycle, so it was just planted to winter wheat when we sampled it. So it was 3 years after it was taken out of CRP. We measured total carbon, organic carbon, particulate organic matter, bulk density, and I measured some other soil properties. And this is under review, but so essentially this isn't in the presentation, but the aggregate stability was reduced a lot when CRP was converted to any of the tillage practices, and it was really reduced when it was converted to the plow sweep or deep plow sweep. And although the carbon concentrations 100% aren't super different because they're so variable, it has a lot really negative effects on soil structural properties when you convert grassland to cropland in this study. And here's a picture of a soil core from this study. And near the surface, it's darker colored, although this is not very dark color. But if you think of the environment, it's not a very productive environment. But you can see it's a little darker colored and there's more organic carbon. And as you move deeper to where there was the calcic-like horizon that I mentioned earlier, it's white colored and there's more inorganic carbon. And if you think a soil has a lot of carbonates, you could pour vinegar or muriatic acid on it, and if it fizzes a lot, it probably has a lot of carbonates. So here are graphs of total carbon, organic carbon, and inorganic carbon that I measured at the different depths. And near the surface, almost in the plowed treatment and in the grassland, almost all the carbon is Total, all the total carbon is organic carbon, and to just go down with depth, in the deepest depth that we sampled, very little of the carbon was organic carbon, and most of the carbon was inorganic carbon. And as you can see, the error bars that I have are standard deviation, which is in which are used in statistics to show how much variation is in the data. And you can see that the error bars are very large on carbon that is measured at certain depths, which means that when we want to calculate the carbon stocks, there's very large uncertainty in what the soil carbon concentration is at the different depth ranges. And to calculate the carbon stocks, we need bulk density, which is a measurement of how dense the soil is, percent carbon, whether you're interested in the organic total carbon or an inorganic carbon stock, and you need the depth that the sample was taken. So here's an example calculation. I converted it to American units. Bulk density is usually measured in grams per centimeter cubed, but in engineering, they use this US unit. So for example, in the CRP treatment, the bulk density is 83.7 pounds per feet cubed, and at 1.59% total carbon in the 0 to 4 inch depth. So to calculate the carbon stock, you need the fraction decimal of the carbon. So you take 0.0159 times the depth of the sample, which is a third of a foot, and multiply it times the bulk density, and you can see the conversion in this bottom, and then you get how much carbon is in a square foot of soil from the 0 to 4 inch depth. And carbon stocks are usually presented in tons per acre and not pounds per square foot. So to convert the pounds per square foot to tons per acre that is in the 0 to 4 inch depth, you multiply times 43560, which is how many feet squared are in an acre, and then divide by 2,000 pounds, which is how many pounds is in a ton, and then you get that there's 9.66 tons in an acre of carbon stored in the 0 to 4 inch depth. And here's an example of the calculation in metric units. The metric calculation is a little easier than the American calculation just because of how the units are set up. But if you're interested in doing it in the metric conversion, it's here. So, and if you look at papers in the literature, they reported in megagrams carbon per hectare. So here's the bulk density from the different treatments. In the 0 to 10 centimeter depth, shoot, I forgot to convert it to inches, or 0 to 4 inches, the bulk density was less in the a little less in the plowed plot, the deep plow plot, than the no-till and disc sweep, but it was right on the edge of being statistically significant, which the bulk density affects how much carbon can be stored. But you can see the standard deviation bars on my data are quite large, some of them are over 5 pounds per cubic feet, which can really affect how much carbon stock is stored in the soil. So here is a graph where I have the US units, the metric units of bulk density, and how much carbon stock changes when it's 1% carbon and 1.5% carbon. So if you increase your pounds per cubic feet of soil by 5, the carbon stock increases by 1.2 tons per acre at 1% carbon and 1.6 tons per acre when the soil is 1.5% carbon. So a little increase in bulk density can really affect what your actual carbon stock is. And bulk density is a soil property that varies a lot when you measure it at a field scale. And also in the study was over like a 2 acre area. It wasn't over like a quarter section or anything. So in a quarter section, your soil bulk density would really vary. And I also measured the bulk density with a better method than using the soil core, which I pictured in the previous picture, where you actually use smaller rings and trim it up nice. And there was still pretty large standard deviations. But I only did that in the 0 to 8 inch depth. Here's the total carbon stocks at the different depths in the study. And there was no statistical difference in total carbon except at the deepest depth. The CRP treatment had more total carbon because it had higher inorganic carbon concentration. But as you can see with the standard deviations, some of these standard deviations are 6 tons per acre when the concentration is 13 tons per acre. So the carbon stocks are very highly variable in the soil. And the organic carbon stock was less in the plowed cropland than the reduced tillage and CRP treatment, which you'd expect near the surface because tilling increases the rate that carbon is broken down in the soil. But in the deeper depths, there was no difference in organic carbon stocks. And the organic carbon stocks is what you are more interested in rather than total carbon, because organic carbon is more easily affected by management than inorganic carbon concentration. And here's the part, as I discussed earlier, there's particulate organic matter carbon, there's inorganic carbon, there's total carbon. And I didn't put the inorganic carbon in this graph, but near the surface, the CRP grassland, which is returning more carbon to the soil and has more living roots near the surface, had higher particulate organic carbon and a little higher total carbon percent than the tilled cropland. The crop treatments had less particulate organic matter carbon than the CRP in the 0 to 4 inch depth, which I would expect because they were in a fallow for a year in the crop rotation they were in. And in the 4 to 8 inch depth, there's less particulate organic matter carbon than in the 0 to 4 inch depth. And this soil has a very high percentage of particulate organic matter carbon. I think that's just because it was really dry the year that we sampled this. And it's in a dry environment where carbon is processed really slow. And the summary is tilling the CRP grassland reduced soil organic carbon stock after 3 years compared to reduced tillage or the grassland. And that when you went to a rotation where there wasn't as much carbon returned, you reduced your particulate organic matter. Here's another study that I did. I'm talking a little long, which is probably okay, but this is in south central Nebraska by Clay Center. There's greater precipitation than the previous site. And this is not an ideal soil health rotation, but it does return a lot of carbon to the soil because corn is a high residue producing crop. And in this study, we had 2 residue removal rates, which is no removal and baling the residue. And we had 3 amendments, which was a cover crop and applying animal manure. And I published these papers in Soil Science Society of America Journal and Journal of Agriculture and Food Research. And here's the bulk density data from the different depths that I sampled, which is 0 to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 6, and 6 to 8, which is used to calculate carbon stocks. And as you can see here, the standard deviation on the bulk density data also is really high. And before I'm going to say the cover crop didn't do anything to soil carbon, the cover crop did reduce bulk density, and applying animal manure reduced bulk density near the surface. But however, there were silly results where the residue removal had higher bulk density than no residue removal. And keeping the residue and adding the cover crop increased wet aggregate stability, which is important for soil and water conservation. And here's the percent soil organic carbon. And adding manure and keeping the residue increased the soil organic carbon by a lot. And the residue removal with no amendment had the lowest soil organic carbon. And the cover crop and manure application when you remove the residue had a little higher carbon than when you removed residue with no amendment, but keeping the residues had more benefit to soil organic carbon than adding the two amendments. And it only affected the soil organic carbon in the 0 to 2 inch depth. And when I converted it to carbon stocks, there was no difference in the carbon stocks below the 0 to 2 inch depth, but keeping your residues increased your carbon stock, and the manure application and residue removal had the highest carbon stock in the 0 to 2 inch depth in total. And cover crops didn't affect the soil carbon stocks, which has to do with the rate. The bulk density affects what your carbon stocks is. So sometimes if you do a soil health practice that reduces your bulk density, even if you have a little soil organic matter increase, when you multiply it together to get the soil carbon stock, you may not increase the soil carbon stock because bulk density and the percent soil carbon, which you would get from sending your soil sample to a lab, affects your soil carbon stock. And in this study, I think because the carbon and nitrogen ratio and balance, removing the residue increased the yield some. Actually, the highest yield was under residue removal with manure application. And the residue, when you baled the residue, you removed about 5,000 pounds of residue per acre, which is about 42% carbon. So you're removing 2,100 pounds of carbon per acre. And when we applied the manure, you added about 1,900 pounds of carbon per acre every other year. And the rye cover crop produced about 530 pounds of biomass annually, which is about 40% carbon. So you're only returning 200 pounds of carbon per year, plus whatever carbon is in the roots, which is probably about 100 pounds of more of carbon. And I assume the soil organic carbon stock was the same at the start of the study. And actually, with previous papers from the study, that in the residue removal treatment, the carbon concentration decreased a little with time. And when you kept the residues, it increased with time. So retaining the residues on your soil increased your soil carbon by 580 pounds per acre per year annually. And compared to keeping residues, adding manure, when you kept residues, increased your carbon stock by 320 pounds annually compared to just keeping the residues. And when you remove the residues, it increased your soil carbon stock by 380 pounds annually compared to removing the residue with no amendment. And when you had the manure application and keeping your residues, you increased it by quite a bit compared to removing residues with no amendment. And the summary is keeping the residues in your field increases your soil carbon stocks, and cover crops had some benefits such as reducing bulk density. And retaining your residues is very important to increasing your soil carbon stock. And that the manure application had more benefit because it returned more carbon than the rye cover crop. And this study was under no-till. I forgot to mention that it was under no-till. And I was looking at a study from Iowa the other day, and they said that tilling reduced your carbon stocks by like 300 pounds annually per year, where no-till increased your carbon stocks by about 200 or 300 pounds annually per year per acre. But probably if you don't keep your residues in no-till, you're probably not going to increase your soil carbon stocks. So that is it for my talk. I went a little long, but
Nope, you're good. You're good, Hans.
feel free to ask me any questions.
We have a question. And I'm gonna paraphrase it because I want to make sure you understand the context. So there are humic acid products that are being sold to farmers, and they're generally added to nitrogen fertilizers to well, the sales pitch is to stabilize those fertilizers. And usually that's from 10 to 20 pounds of humic acid per acre. Okay. So the question is, does adding humic acid to the soil change or help build organic carbon?
I think I think it potentially could, because some of it could be converted to mineral associated organic carbon, and it also could add organic matter, which can help retain nutrients. I think we need to do some trials to see how much it actually benefits and see what soils it would benefit the best. Like probably if we added it to a high clay soil with low soil organic matter, it would be retained and become mineral associated carbon.
But if you added 20 pounds an acre, what effect would that have?
I don't think that's very much carbon when you go to 20 pounds an acre, because the soil that didn't have, so what they say the carbon stock was like 8 tons per acre in a soil with only 1.5% carbon.
Yeah. So if you added 20 pounds,
That's really not that much.
it's really not that much. Okay. Well, if you want to stop sharing,
Okay.
I think that was the only question that I could see so far. Okay, thank you, Hans. I need to apologize before I get started. I've only got 13 slides, so this won't take long. But
That works fine because I didn't
yep,
practice mine and I went a little long.
yeah,
So
you bet. Okay. So I have to apologize because I did not properly introduce Hans. Hans is our new soil health field specialist, and he is located in the Watertown office. So we're happy to have Hans. He's got a rich and strong science background in soil physics, and that includes carbon as well. And so we're happy to have Hans. So I think all of those topics that Hans presented are important, really important, because it's not intended to confuse. It's intended to educate about all the details and all of the things that you have to consider when you're thinking about carbon, and so it kind of creates a conundrum, and that's kind of how we come up with our title. But I'm going to do a little bit more talk about soil health principles and comparisons of different things, but I always like to talk about the soil health principles. The
okay,
five.
I'll introduce you.
Oh,
So
that's okay.
this is Anthony Bly. He's a soil extension field specialist, and he's in the Sioux Falls Regional Extension Center, and he's also an agricultural producer in South Dakota.
Thank you, Hans. Anyway, the soil health principles, I think if you've seen me speak or others, the Soil Health Coalition, they talk about five. I'm not trying to change them by doing it this way, but it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. We have physical part of soil health principles, and we have a biological part. And so both the physical and biological properties are so important. And then we marry the two. There's the chemical aspect as well, but you can't have some of the benefits without the others, or improve some of the benefits without using the other principles. So they all work together. And I think that's why in the 90s, when a lot of producers just tried no-till, they quickly realized that, it couldn't work for them because they ran into a year with too much rain. As Hans discussed, the bulk densities, change. And so we have to keep the ground covered. That's foremost the most important thing. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And to do that, you need to limit tillage. I mean, those work hand in hand. That allows the soil to develop. It allows it to increase biological diversity. It's favorable for the biology, but really, the biological diversity is probably the most important part. And we get that, or we increase that diversity by growing a living root as much as possible. And we can look to perennials and cover crops to do that beyond our corn and soybean and wheat rotation. We also increase diversity by using that rotation, and cover crops are part of that, and wheat are part of that. And I hear all the time, I can't make any money growing wheat, or I can't make any money growing oats. And annually, that's probably a true statement sometimes. I mean, we probably, we have to admit that, but I would challenge anyone that's a farmer who wants to be a farmer or is working with a farmer. Do you farm for 1 year and then just quit? And the answer to that is absolutely no. You want to farm or work with that farmer, if you're an agronomist, for their whole career. You want to make it a career. And so investing in our soil is paramount to making that. Think of a house. Build a new house this year, and then don't do any care for that house. And in 40 years or 50 years, what will that house look like? The roof will be falling in. So our soil is a lot like that. If we don't take care of it, our soil goes backwards. And that's why, Hans mentioned all of the snert and dirt in the ditch. I mean, that's an example of a poor soil health, condition. And then integrating livestock is part of that biological diversity, help cycle nutrients and stabilize that carbon into that mineral associated carbon. So all important things. Just learn these principles and focus on these principles, and you can help diagnose a lot of problems out there if you understand these. So just a simple organic carbon to organic matter conversion here. I know a lot of the soil tests only have organic matter, and like Hans said, 58% is soil carbon. So these are the two equations that you can just quickly convert soil organic matter to organic carbon. And this graph should help you feel better about that, because this is the relationship between soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. And this is real data from South Dakota. And many other people have data just like this. And so you can feel really confident about using those equations to convert. I mean, it does a really good job. So basically, why soil health? Why more carbon? I'm going to talk about it as organic matter, and because eventually it's gonna take the place of our inorganic fertilizers, of our synthetic fertilizers. I really believe that. I'm confident that we can get there in a number of years, maybe decades, but we have to start. And I'll show you another slide why I really think it's important. But this is just an example of a nitrogen response study in 2018. This is kind of what we're all after. We want more for less. And so we maximized yield that year, a very wet year in 2018, with just over 50 pounds of nitrogen. If we look at that, that's a huge return on investment. But this site had been in no-till and entered into more soil health practices in that period as well, with cover crops and a rotation. It had 5% organic matter, over 5% organic matter. So we can't get here unless we think about the carbon. All of those things that Hans talked about. So this is a summary of all of the data from nitrogen sites that Jason Clark and I have done. At this site, the optimal rate was just slightly over 50. Let's call it 55 pounds. There is what I've calculated. So these numbers are a summary of all of those optimum N rates at each one of those sites. And you can see they vary from 0 to 100, over 150 pounds per acre. Well, we know a little bit about each one of these sites. And I can tell you that the bottom ones are on farms where we have what we would consider our leading soil health producers. I'm not saying that every year they don't need any nitrogen. That's not what we're saying at all, because that is a moving target. But what I am saying is they generally speaking need a lot less. And so, I spoke to some Votech students, and I said to them, I said, if you're from one of these farms or a farm like that, consider it a huge gift for your career. But if you're not from one of those farms, I think it's time to start working towards that. And basically, this graph shows the journey, right? It shows poor soil health on the right side with a lot of nitrogen demand from synthetic fertilizer to excellent or good soil health down on the left and reducing the demand for nitrogen fertilizer. So that's the journey right there that you can embark on by focusing on soil health. So this is just a relationship of soil organic matter and corn yield at one location that we studied for 3 years. And I calculated that for every 2% organic matter change in the soil, that means 58 bushels of corn. Okay. Or for every 1%, that's 27 bushels of corn. So it means something. And we all know this. We all know that soils higher in organic matter are more productive. So it's time we get going on that. Tillage reduces organic matter. Just a study out of North Carolina here. No-till having the highest particulate organic matter, and as we increase tillage intensity, that organic matter is going down. We can see it visually. I show this slide, I think, every time I speak about soil health. It's so impactful. It really kind of encouraged me or confirmed that what I was doing a decade ago was correct. The soil on the left is conventionally managed, maybe silage and alfalfa and tillage, lots of tillage. There's no structure there, and it's lighter colored. The organic matter is not there. The soil on the right is long-term no-till, and only in a corn soybean rotation for 25 to 30 years, and you can see the difference. So you can learn a lot by looking. So Hans mentioned cover crops. I just wanted to kind of just quickly discuss when we think you can be most successful in introducing them into your crop rotation. We kind of like flying cereal rye into mature corn. We think that has the highest chance of success. We want to see successes. Of course, if you're a risk taker, you can do all of those other things that you hear people talk about, but we're focusing on a higher probability of success. And planted after any silage harvest is just I hate this term, but I'll just say it. It's a no-brainer. You don't have to think very hard about that one. You have lots of time to get that in, to get the cover crop in and get it up and established. So every silage acre should have cover crops. And then of course, after our sealer grades, that's just another excellent way to get them out there. So these three approaches, not talking about what species you should put out there other than I mentioned rye, but you have to work with someone to develop what species you should plant. So this is just focusing on the timing. So I want to kind of the last few slides go into what the world is talking about. And, I did a quick internet search and found a whole bunch of firms that want to buy carbon from farmers. And they have various different reasons. Society is offering up money to some of these firms, and these firms are looking for places to buy carbon. And that's carbon that is sequestered or taken out of the atmosphere. There's a lot more. And I want to also say that SDSU is not a carbon program. That's just our logo in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. But anyway, the three in the top right-hand corner up there are the newest ones that I know about. So I had to add them in there as well. So what about your farm's carbon neutrality? Is it important to you, or is it important to somebody else? Um, and I think we need to think about the future. Will we be required to become or to move towards more carbon neutrality on our farm? Will there be an additional tax on fossil fuels that release greenhouse gases when they're burned? I don't know what could happen, but I know carbon's important for crop productivity, and I know that you need to keep it to maybe offset that carbon neutrality sometime in the future. But why are all these firms wanting it? Because some of their customers want to offset some of their practices that aren't going more carbon neutral. So they're trying to get that easy carbon at the beginning of all of this talk in the world today. So I think you should think about this and be concerned about it. And I'm not trying to talk you out of not signing an agreement with any one of these companies that I listed here. I'm not saying any of this is bad, but I'm trying to educate to the fact you should think about where you stand at all of this, and please understand what you're signing before you sign it. Just there's a lot of small print. Just make sure you understand that. So we did last two slides here. We did a study in South Dakota where we're comparing what we called at the time conventional farms and no-till farms. Little summary of some of the data that we found here. These farms were paired. So at each site, we had one conventional and one no-till, and we had 4 sites. Just a summary, similar size, similar corn yield. Where the differences occurred is in the amount of diesel that they used. Conventional almost twice what a no-till farm would be. The nitrogen rate is really similar. The phosphorus rate, potassium rate, I think we could argue that they're similar. They're not really that far apart. I think it's just coming down to farmers making decisions and wanting to manage maybe for a little bit higher or lower soil test level. Herbicide use, very similar. We got their records for that. So that myth about no-till taking more herbicide, it's not true in this case. Cover crop use, none of the conventional farms were using cover crops, but 3 of the no-till farms were. None of the conventional farms had livestock, and only 1 of the no-till farms did. And then another big comparison is the equipment investment. Here we see those conventional farms having almost $600 an acre invested in equipment, while the no-till farms just slightly over $350. So a $225 difference in equipment investment. Now you think about upkeep, repair, and depreciation, and replacing that equipment. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. And I think of new producers starting out, maybe starting on that soil health journey, trying to regenerate soil. They're going to be able to do that easier with less equipment. Now that paper or that article is at this web link here at the bottom. I quick pasted that in. But if you just go search SDSU Anthony Bly, click on one of the links there, that takes you to where I'm at on extension. And then you just, scroll down a little bit, you'll find this article if you want to investigate it a little bit more. And then lastly, we took that data and we put it on what I would consider the most accepted popular carbon models that is out there. This GREET model from our Argonne Labs, which is the Department of Energy, United States Department of Energy is working on this. And I put those numbers in there, and we can see that the conventional farm basically has no carbon being stored in the soil, and that would be represented by that 0 line. So we can think of that 0 line as the soil surface in a way. So it's all positive on that conventional side. And we compare that to the no-till side that has cover crops. 3 of those 4 farms had cover crops, so I use that in that model. And we can see that there's some green below the soil surface. There's a lot of additions to soil carbon for following those soil health principles. But I'd like to say, going back to this discussion about about firms wanting to buy your carbon or wanting to pay you to do practices that put carbon in the soil. If we subtract the differences here, the negatives and the positives, we can clearly see that, the conventional till has nothing to offer. So, they're 7,874 in the positive. This is grams of carbon per bushel of corn produced. But the no-till farm is a lot less, but it's still positive. It's still positive. There's still room on those no-till farms to reduce carbon. And so, we're not trying to pick and poke at what people are doing. We're trying to just show where people are at. And so that no-till farm doesn't have any carbon to sell either, in my mind. I mean, there's none to sell. It's still positive. So there's room for improvement with each. And that's the important thing. We're all in this together, and we're trying to learn and go forward. And so there's room for improvement in each. So with that, I'm done. Caught us up to our time. I believe it's time. The hour is done, and
Okay, there's a couple questions, and the one question I think both of us can answer, and the one question you should answer.
okay.
So the first question is, where does the nitrogen for corn in the high organic matter soil come from? Are the soils fixed microbes fixing nitrogen? And I guess it's probably hard to determine how much of the actual microbes in the soil can fix nitrogen, but a lot of the organic carbon compounds in the soil have nitrogen in them, and then when they're mineralized, they will release nitrogen that the plants can take up. You can further answer that question.
No, Hans, you did a great job with that. That's exactly right. In that high organic matter soil, the nitrogen pool is a lot bigger than if it would be 2%. And so all of that microbial activity is working, and there's autotrophs there that are taking atmospheric nitrogen in. There's microbes that are dying, and there's microbes that are eating other microbes. And please come to tomorrow. Jim Ristow will talk more about the details of this soil biology, but the system is bigger. There's 1,000 pounds of organic nitrogen for every 1% organic carbon. And so as we build that pool, or that source, bigger and bigger and bigger by our soil health practices, you see, it's that journey. It's that journey. It's not instantaneous. Next year, you're going to need less nitrogen. You'll probably need more nitrogen for the first few years, until you really start to get that soil carbon built. And then I think it's that downhill slope that starts. So the system is just bigger, and pulling a little bit of nitrogen off for corn is no big deal. When you have a whole herd of microorganisms working for you. Think of it this way: if you have a herd of 100,000 bison, and you take 10 of them, can you tell a difference? If you take 100, can you tell a difference? You take 1,000, can you tell a difference? No, you can't. That's what it's like having the soil biology and the carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle built up in the soil. You put that corn plant there, you hardly notice you taking any off of that. And I think
And this
we
question
could
is
get
a
there.
quicker one. Are
Sure.
there many producers participating in carbon credit programs in South Dakota?
From the producers that I talked to, I would say no. I do know of a few that have. One of those has told me he wished he didn't. That is not a statement against other programs. I don't, we have to remain unbiased. I'm trying to remain unbiased and educate at the same time. But farmers are reluctant from entering into these agreements in general.
Okay, so I think that's it for Q&A. So please attend. If you're interested in learning more about soil biology, please attend our webinar tomorrow at the same time as today.
Very good. Okay. Well, I think we're done. Thank you.